The blood had frozen to her dress before she even realized how badly the bullet had torn through her side. Zelda James stumbled through the white curtain of falling snow, each breath a knife in her lungs, each step a prayer she might take one more before the cold claimed her entirely. The November storm had descended on the Colorado mountains with a vengeance, transforming the trail from Leadville into a white hell, where earth and sky became one endless blur. She pressed her hand against the wound, feeling the sticky warmth beneath layers of wool and cotton, knowing that warmth would not last long in air so cold it burned. Behind her, somewhere in that storm, the men who had shot her were either dead or still hunting. The stagecoach robbery had gone wrong in ways Zelda still could not fully comprehend. She had been riding shotgun with her uncle's freight company, transporting mining payroll through the mountain passes, when the masked riders had appeared like ghosts from the tree line. Gunfire had erupted before anyone could speak. Her uncle Samuel had taken a bullet to the chest and fallen from the driver's box. The horses had bolted in terror, and in the chaos, Zelda had fired back, watching one of the robbers tumble from his saddle. But then the searing pain had exploded in her side, and she had fallen, rolling down an embankment into deep snow while the stagecoach thundered away into the storm without her. Now she was alone, bleeding, and so cold that her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves. The trail beneath her feet had disappeared under a foot of fresh powder, and the wind howled through the pines with a sound like mourning. Zelda knew she was dying. The thought came to her with strange clarity, as if her mind had accepted what her body still fought against. She had turned 23 just last week, and her uncle had promised her a partnership in the freight business come spring. All those plans meant nothing now. Her foot caught on something buried beneath the snow, and she fell hard, crying out as the impact sent fresh agony through her wounded side. The world spun, white and gray and darker gray, and when she tried to push herself up, her arms would not obey. The snow beneath her face felt almost warm now, which she knew was a terrible sign. She had heard stories of men freezing to death in the mountains, how they felt hot at the end, how they shed their clothes and died naked in the snow. Zelda tried to move, but her body had become a distant thing, disconnected from her will. She thought of her mother back in St. Louis, who had begged her not to come west. She thought of her father, dead these 10 years, who had always told her she had the heart of a pioneer. She closed her eyes and waited for the darkness. The sound of a horse snorting brought her back from the edge. At first she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard the creak of leather and the crunch of boots in snow. Strong hands rolled her onto her back, and through the veil of falling snow she saw a face, weathered and angular, with eyes the color of smoke. "Good God," the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. "What in hell happened to you?" Zelda tried to speak, but her lips would not form words. The man knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face with gloved hands. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she thought distantly, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a thick beard that could not hide the concern in his expression. "Can you hear me?" he asked. When she managed the smallest nod, he continued, "I am going to check your injuries. Do not try to move." His hands moved with surprising gentleness, finding the bullet wound in her side. She heard him curse under his breath. "This is bad, but you are still breathing, which means we have a chance. My name is Wade Owens. I have a cabin about 3 miles from here." "Can you hold on that long?" 3 miles might as well have been 300. Zelda could barely hold on to consciousness. She felt him lifting her, heard him speaking in low tones to his horse, and then she was being settled across the saddle in front of him, wrapped in something heavy and warm that smelled of leather and wood smoke. His arm circled her waist, holding her secure against his chest, and even through her failing senses she could feel the steady strength in him. "Stay with me now," Wade said, his voice close to her ear. "I did not drag you onto my horse just to have you die on me." The journey that followed existed in fragments. Zelda drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of the horse's labored breathing as it pushed through deep snow, of Wade's arm tight around her, of his voice speaking to her constantly, telling her about the cabin, about his cattle, about anything to keep her tethered to life. Once she felt herself slipping away entirely and his voice became sharp, almost angry. "No," he said firmly, "you do not get to quit. I have carried you too damn far for you to quit now. Open your eyes." She did, meeting his gaze, and something in those smoke-gray eyes anchored her. He nodded once, satisfied, and urged his horse forward through the driving snow. The storm had intensified until Wade could barely see 10 feet ahead. The trail had vanished completely, but his horse knew the way home, picking its path by instinct and memory. Wade held the woman against him, feeling how cold she had become despite the blanket he had wrapped around her. Her breathing had grown shallow and rapid, and he knew she was sliding into shock from blood loss and exposure. He had to get her warm, had to stop the bleeding, had to do it soon or she would die. He had been checking his trap lines when he found her, a dark shape in the snow that he had almost missed. Wade ran a small ranch in the foothills outside Leadville, supplementing his income through the hard winters by trapping and occasionally working as a guide for miners who did not know the mountain passes. He had been alone for the better part of 2 years, ever since his wife had died giving birth to a child who had not survived either. The grief had driven him into these isolated mountains, where he did not have to face the pitying looks of townspeople, or the memories that haunted every corner of the life they had built together. He had grown accustomed to solitude, even welcomed it, but now, holding this stranger against the cold, Wade felt something long dormant stir in his chest. She was fighting so hard to live, this woman with blood on her dress and ice in her hair. He could feel the stubborn strength in her, even as her body failed. Wade knew about fighting to survive, about refusing to surrender to the things that tried to break you. Maybe that was why he found himself willing her to hold on with an intensity that surprised him. "Almost there," he said, though he could not be certain in the whiteout conditions. "Just a little further." When the dark shape of his cabin finally emerged from the storm, Wade felt relief flood through him. He dismounted carefully, keeping the woman secure in his arms, and carried her to the door. His horse would find shelter in the small barn behind the cabin, smart enough to get out of the weather. Right now, this woman's life depended on the next few hours, and Wade could not afford to waste time. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the fire in the hearth having died to ash during his absence. Wade laid the woman on his bed, the only real furniture in the single-room cabin besides a table, 2 chairs, and the shelves he had built into the walls. He worked quickly, striking flint to tinder and coaxing a fire to life. Once flames began licking at the dry wood he had stacked that morning, he turned his full attention to his patient. Her lips had taken on a blue tinge, and her skin felt like ice. Wade knew he had to warm her, but first he had to address the bullet wound. He cut away the blood-soaked fabric of her dress and the layers beneath, working with the clinical efficiency of a man who had tended wounded cattle and horses throughout his life. The bullet had torn through the flesh just above her hip, missing anything vital by what looked like inches. The bleeding had slowed to a seep, which was good, but the wound was ugly and would need cleaning. Wade heated water over the growing fire and gathered his limited medical supplies. A bottle of whiskey, clean cloth torn from an old shirt, needle, and thread. When he poured the whiskey over the wound to clean it, the woman's eyes flew open and she screamed, a raw sound of agony that made his heart clench. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "I know," he said quietly, holding her gaze. "I know it hurts. But I have to clean it or infection will kill you. Can you be brave for me?" Her eyes, he noticed for the first time, were the deep blue of a summer sky, striking against her pale face. She gave a small nod and released his wrist, but her hand sought his and held tight. Wade threaded the needle, took a breath, and began stitching the wound closed. She did not scream again, but he felt her hand tighten on his until he thought his bones might crack. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold, and tears ran down her temples into her dark hair, but she did not pull away. When he finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound with clean cloth, Wade realized he was shaking. He pulled a heavy quilt over her and only then released her hand. The woman's eyes had closed again, her breathing steadier now, though her skin still felt far too cold. Wade knew what had to be done, and he did not allow himself to hesitate. He stripped away her wet, cold clothing, trying to maintain some semblance of modesty while knowing that propriety mattered less than survival right now. He wrapped her in every dry blanket he owned, then added his own body heat, lying beside her and holding her against him while the fire warmed the cabin around them. "My name is Zelda," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Zelda James." "Hold on, Zelda James," Wade said. "Morning will come and you will still be here to see it." She stirred against him, and he felt her relax slightly, her body accepting the warmth he offered. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, Wade kept vigil through the long night, feeding the fire and monitoring her breathing, refusing to sleep lest she slip away while he was not watching. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm still howling around the cabin walls. Zelda woke to pain and warmth in equal measure, confused by both. Her side felt like fire, but the rest of her was blessedly warm, wrapped in blankets and pressed against something solid and warm. Memory returned in pieces. The robbery, the shooting, the storm, and the man who had found her, Wade. She opened her eyes to find him sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching her with those steady gray eyes. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, beard rough with more than one day's growth. But when he saw she was awake, something like relief crossed his features. "You made it through the night," he said. "That is a good sign. How do you feel?" "Like I was shot and then frozen," Zelda said, her voice hoarse. "But alive. Thank you for that." Wade stood and checked her forehead with the back of his hand. "No fever yet. That is even better. Are you hungry?" "Thirsty?" "Both," she admitted. He brought her water first, helping her sit up enough to drink without pulling her stitches. Then he heated broth from a pot that had been simmering over the fire, and she managed several swallows before exhaustion claimed her again. Through the morning and into the afternoon, she drifted in and out of sleep, while Wade tended the fire and periodically checked her wound for signs of infection. The storm continued for 3 days. During that time, Wade cared for Zelda with a patience and gentleness that surprised them both. He changed her bandages, brought her food and water, helped her manage the indignities of her condition without ever making her feel ashamed. In the hours when she was awake and lucid, they talked. Zelda told him about the robbery, about her uncle who might or might not be dead, about the freight business and her plans for the future. Wade listened without judgment, though she saw his jaw tighten when she described the men who had ambushed the stagecoach. "They will likely think you died in the storm," Wade said. "That might be to your advantage once you are well enough to travel. The question is whether they got away with the payroll." "They did not," Zelda said. "The driver kept going when I fell. The payroll should have made it to Leadville if the horses stayed on the trail. Wade nodded slowly. Then they failed, and they lost at least one man by your account. Desperate men who failed at robbery tend to be dangerous. You will need to be careful when you return to town. If I return, Zelda said quietly, my uncle might be dead, the business might be finished. Do not borrow trouble, Wade said. Heal first, worry about the rest later. But it was not just the future that occupied their conversations. Wade, with characteristic reluctance, told her about his ranch, about the cattle he raised and the hard winters he endured. She learned that he had come to Colorado from Texas 5 years ago, bringing his new wife to start fresh in the booming mining territory. She learned about the deaths that had hollowed him out and sent him retreating into these mountains. I am sorry, Zelda said when he finished. That is a heavy grief to carry. Everyone carries something, Wade replied. He was whittling a piece of wood by the fire, his hands moving with practiced ease. The question is whether you let it bury you or whether you keep moving forward. Which did you choose? She asked. He looked at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I thought I chose to keep moving. But looking back, I think maybe I just chose a different way of being buried. Until 3 days ago, anyway. The intensity of his gaze made her heart beat faster, and Zelda found herself looking away, suddenly shy. She was acutely aware that she was lying in his bed, wearing one of his shirts, dependent on him for everything. It should have made her feel vulnerable and uncomfortable. Instead, she felt safe in a way she had not felt since her father died. By the 4th day, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside transformed into a pristine wilderness of white. Zelda was strong enough to sit up on her own and even take a few careful steps around the cabin, though her side protested every movement. Wade had gone out to check on his horse and assess the conditions, and when he returned, his expression was troubled. The snow is deep, he said, brushing ice from his coat. Too deep for travel, especially for someone in your condition. We might be stuck here another week, maybe more, until either the snow settles or we get a warm spell. I am sorry to be such a burden, Zelda said. Wade's head snapped up, his eyes sharp. You are not a burden. You are a person who needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Do not apologize for surviving. The fierceness in his voice startled her, but it also warmed something deep in her chest. She watched as he hung his coat and hat, as he fed the fire and set about preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. He moved with economy and grace, every action purposeful, and Zelda found herself studying him with more than casual interest. Wade Owens was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered, too marked by hardship and sorrow. But there was strength in him, both physical and moral, that drew her like iron to a lodestone. She had known men who were charming and men who were kind, but Wade possessed something deeper, an essential decency that no amount of grief had managed to corrupt. Over the following days, as Zelda grew stronger and the snow outside remained impassable, something shifted between them. Conversation came easier, punctuated by comfortable silences. Wade taught her to play cards with a battered deck he produced from somewhere, and she taught him a song her father had sung when she was young. They argued amicably about politics and laughed over shared stories of frontier absurdities. In the evenings, Wade would read aloud from the 2 books he owned, a volume of Shakespeare and a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. His voice, rough from disuse, grew smoother with practice, and Zelda would close her eyes and let the words wash over her like music. She caught him watching her sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, and the expression on his face made her pulse quicken. It was not mere attraction, though she felt that too, a growing awareness of his physical presence that made her skin tingle when he checked her wound or helped her across the room. It was something deeper, a kind of wondering, as if he could not quite believe she was real. One evening, 10 days after he had found her in the storm, Zelda stood at the cabin's single window, watching the sun set over the snow-covered mountains. The sky burned gold and pink and purple, so beautiful it made her chest ache. Wade came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "It is lovely," she said softly. "Yes," Wade agreed, but when she glanced at him, he was not looking at the sunset. He was looking at her. Their eyes met and held, and the air between them seemed to thicken with everything unspoken. Zelda's heart hammered in her chest. She knew she should step back, should laugh and break the tension, should remember that she barely knew this man and that gratitude was not the same as love. But she did not want to step back. She wanted to lean forward, to close the small distance between them, to see if his lips were as warm as his hands. Wade's hand came up slowly, giving her every chance to move away, and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Zelda felt herself leaning into the touch like a flower seeking sun. "Zelda," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "I should not. You are hurt, and you are here because you had no choice, and I would not take advantage of that for anything in this world." "What if I want you to?" she whispered. His eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought he would close the distance between them. But then he let his hand fall and took a step back, and disappointment flooded through her. "When you are healed," Wade said carefully, "and when you are free to leave if you still want this, then we will talk. But not now. Not while you are dependent on me. That would not be right." Zelda wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that her feelings had nothing to do with dependence and everything to do with the man he was. But she also recognized the integrity in his restraint, even as it frustrated her. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and returned to the bed. That night, Wade lay on the floor near the fire, as he had every night since she could manage without his body heat to keep her warm. But Zelda lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about gray eyes and gentle hands and a man who valued her autonomy enough to deny them both what they wanted. The warm spell came 2 days later, the temperature rising above freezing for the first time in weeks. The snow began to melt, slowly at first and then with increasing speed as sun and warmth worked their alchemy. Wade announced that the trail would be passable within a day or two, and they should prepare to travel to Leadville. Zelda should have been relieved. She needed to find out what had happened to her uncle, needed to salvage what she could of the business, needed to return to her life. Instead, she felt a growing dread. Once they reached town, this strange intimacy would shatter. Wade would return to his lonely cabin, and she would return to whatever future awaited her. And the connection that had been growing between them would wither like a plant denied water. On the morning they prepared to leave, Zelda stood in the cabin doorway, looking at the small space that had been her whole world for nearly 2 weeks. It seemed impossible that such a simple place could hold such significance, but every corner held memory now. The bed where she had fought for life, the table where they had played cards and talked until the fire burned low, the window where Wade had almost kissed her. Wade finished loading supplies onto his horse and came to stand beside her. "Ready?" he asked. No, Zelda thought. I am not ready at all, but she nodded and let him help her into the saddle. The wound in her side had healed enough that movement no longer brought sharp pain, just a dull ache that reminded her how close she had come to death. Wade swung up behind her, his arm settling around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar, and urged the horse forward. The trail down from the mountains was treacherous with mud and slush, but the horse picked its way carefully, and Wade guided them with the confidence of a man who knew every rock and turn. They traveled in silence, and Zelda tried to memorize the feeling of being held against him, knowing these might be the last hours they spent together. Leadville came into view in the late afternoon, a sprawling collection of buildings and mine works clinging to the mountainside at over 10,000 feet elevation. The town had exploded from a small mining camp to a city of thousands in just a few years, fueled by the discovery of massive silver deposits. It was rough and wild and loud, everything Wade's cabin was not, and as they rode down the main street, Zelda felt a physical pain at the thought of saying goodbye. Wade stopped at the office of the Leadville Chronicle, the town's newspaper, and inquired about the stagecoach robbery. The clerk, a young man with ink stains on his fingers, nodded eagerly. Big news, that was. Driver brought the stage and shot to hell, but with the payroll intact. One guard killed Samuel James. Real shame that. His niece was with him, but she fell off during the attack. Posse went out looking, but the storm hit and they figured she was dead. They caught 2 of the robbers, hanged them last week. Third one got away, but the marshal thinks he headed south. Zelda closed her eyes, grief washing over her. Uncle Samuel dead. She had known it was likely, but confirmation still hit like a blow. Wade's arm tightened around her, silent support, and she was grateful for it. "Thank you," Wade said to the clerk and guided the horse away. They stopped next at the small hotel where Zelda had stayed when she first came to Leadville. The proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Henderson, nearly fainted when she saw Zelda alive. "Good Lord, girl," she exclaimed. "We thought you were dead and buried under snow. How did you survive?" "This man found me and saved my life," Zelda said, indicating Wade. "Wade Owens. He carried me through the storm to his cabin and nursed me back to health." Mrs. Henderson looked at Wade with new respect, though Zelda saw calculation in the older woman's eyes as well. A young woman alone with a man for 2 weeks would set tongues wagging, never mind the circumstances. Zelda felt anger rise in her at the unfairness of it, but Wade seemed not to notice or perhaps not to care. "I will leave you here," Wade said quietly. "You need to rest and to deal with your uncle's affairs. I should get back to my ranch." Panic flared in Zelda's chest. "Wait, I need to pay you for your trouble to thank you properly." "You owe me nothing," Wade said firmly. "I did what anyone would do." "That is not true, and you know it," Zelda said. She reached out and caught his hand, not caring who saw. "Please, do not just ride away. I need to see you again." Something flickered in his eyes, hope and fear warring. "Zelda, your uncle just died. You have a business to manage or sell. Your life is complicated enough without adding me to it." "My life has been complicated since the day I was born," Zelda said fiercely. "And I am asking you not to disappear. Please, Wade, can you at least stay in town tonight? Give me time to think, to figure things out." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I will get a room. But Zelda, I meant what I said in the cabin. You need to be sure about what you want. Do not let gratitude confuse you." "It is not gratitude," she said, but he was already turning away, leading his horse toward the livery stable. Mrs. Henderson watched him go, then looked at Zelda with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "That man carried you through a blizzard, 3 miles, Zelda said. "In the worst storm I have ever seen. He saved my life, Mrs. Henderson, and I think I might love him for more than just that." The older woman's expression softened. "Well then, you had better not let him leave town without telling him so. Men like that do not come along often, and they tend not to wait around if they think they are not wanted." Zelda spent the rest of the day dealing with the grim necessities of death. Her uncle's body had already been buried, but there were debts to settle and assets to account for. The freight business was smaller than she had thought. her uncle having borrowed heavily to finance the operation. The lawyers told her she could sell it, probably for enough to clear the debts and leave her with a modest sum, or she could try to run it herself, though they made it clear they thought a woman incapable of such work. By evening, Zelda was exhausted and heartsore. She returned to the hotel, where Mrs. Henderson informed her that Wade had indeed taken a room but had gone out. Zelda ate a silent dinner in her room, staring at the wall, trying to sort through the tangle of her thoughts and feelings. She did love him. The certainty of it had been growing since that evening at the window, maybe even before that. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his integrity and his wounded soul that matched her own. She loved the way he had held her through the storm, the way he had read poetry by firelight, the way he had respected her enough to deny them both what they wanted, until she was truly free to choose. But what did she have to offer him? A failed freight business and a reputation that would be in tatters once word spread about the 2 weeks they had spent alone together. Wade had his ranch, his solitude, his careful distance from the pain of the world. Did she have the right to ask him to risk his heart again? A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Wade stood in the hallway, hat in his hands, looking uncertain in a way she had never seen him. "May I come in?" he asked. "I know it is not proper, but I need to talk to you." Zelda stepped back, letting him enter. He moved to the window, looking out at the dark street below, and she waited, giving him space to find his words. "I have been thinking," Wade said finally, not turning to face her. "About what you said earlier about wanting to see me again. I need you to understand something, Zelda. These past 2 weeks, taking care of you, talking with you, just being with you, it woke something in me that I thought was dead. I feel alive again, and that terrifies me." He turned then, and the naked vulnerability in his face made her heart clench. "I lost everything once," Wade continued, his voice rough. "My wife, my child, my faith in a future that held anything but loneliness. I survived it, but barely. If I let myself care for you, if I let myself hope again and then lose you too, I do not think I could survive that a second time. So I need to know, before this goes any further, whether you are sure. Because I am already halfway to loving you, Zelda James, and if you are going to break my heart, I would rather you do it now than later." Zelda crossed the room to him, ignoring the pull of her healing wound, and took his hands in hers. "I am sure," she said, looking up into those gray eyes that had become her anchor. "I have been sure since you refused to kiss me in the cabin because you wanted me to be free to choose. I am choosing you, Wade Owens. I am choosing this, whatever this becomes." "You could go back east," Wade said, but his hands tightened on hers. "Sell the business, return to St. Louis, find an easier life than anything Colorado can offer." "I could," Zelda agreed. "Or I could stay here in this wild, beautiful place, with a man who carried me 3 miles through a blizzard and read me poetry, and made me want to fight for life when it would have been easier to let go. That sounds like a far better choice to me." Wade pulled her into his arms then, carefully, mindful of her injury, and held her as if she were something precious and fragile and worth protecting. Zelda wrapped her arms around him and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was where she belonged, in the embrace of this strong, wounded, decent man who had saved her life and stolen her heart. "I do not have much to offer," Wade said against her hair. "A cabin in the mountains, a small herd of cattle, a life that will be hard more often than easy." "I do not need much," Zelda said. "Just you, and a future we can build together." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. "Then I am asking you, Zelda James, if you would consider becoming my wife. Not today and not tomorrow, because you need time to be certain and to heal and to settle your uncle's affairs. But someday when you are ready, would you marry me?" "Yes," Zelda said, the word coming easily and surely. "Yes, I will marry you, Wade Owens." This time, when he lowered his head to kiss her, there was no hesitation. His lips met hers with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears, and Zelda felt something inside her click into place, like a key turning in a lock. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person. Not safety, but the courage to risk your heart even when you knew how badly love could hurt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I will court you properly," he said. "I will come into town every week, and we will go to church socials and dances, and I will show everyone that you are choosing me of your own free will, not out of obligation or gratitude." "People will talk anyway," Zelda said, "about the 2 weeks we spent alone." "Let them talk," Wade said fiercely. "I know the truth, and so do you. That is all that matters." True to his word, Wade courted Zelda with a determination and devotion that quickly became legendary in Leadville. Every Sunday he rode into town, dressed in his best clothes, and escorted her to church. Every week he took her to dinner, or to dances at the community hall, or on long walks through the mountains as her strength returned. He was never anything but respectful in public, but the way he looked at her left no doubt about his feelings, and Zelda met his gaze with equal openness. The gossip was intense at first. People whispered about the propriety of a young woman spending 2 weeks alone with a bachelor, about Wade's dead wife, and whether enough time had passed, about Zelda's future, and whether she was making a mistake tying herself to a rancher instead of returning to civilization. But as weeks turned into months, the gossip faded in the face of their obvious devotion to each other. Even the most hardened skeptics had to admit that what they saw between Zelda James and Wade Owens was genuine. Zelda sold her uncle's freight business, settling his debts and putting the remainder into an account at the bank. She wrote to her mother in St. Louis, explaining what had happened and her decision to stay in Colorado. Her mother's response was predictably worried, but she included her blessing and the hope that Zelda would bring her new husband to visit once they were married. As spring crept into the mountains, melting the last of the winter snow and coaxing wildflowers from the earth, Zelda and Wade began making plans. They would marry in June, when the high country was at its most beautiful. Wade was expanding his cabin, adding a second room and a proper kitchen, working every spare moment to make it a home worthy of a wife. Zelda helped when he would let her, and slowly the place where she had nearly died became the place where she would start her new life. The wedding took place on a brilliant June morning with the entire town of Leadville in attendance. Zelda wore a dress of cream silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that Wade had picked from the meadow behind his cabin. Wade wore a new suit and looked simultaneously proud and terrified as he waited for her at the front of the church. When Zelda walked down the aisle and saw his face, saw the love and wonder in his eyes, she knew she was making the right choice. The ceremony was simple but moving. When Wade slipped a gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for all his days, his voice was steady and sure. When Zelda made her own vows, promising to stand beside him through whatever trials life brought, she meant every word with a fierceness that surprised even her. They held a reception at the hotel, with music and dancing and food that half the town had contributed. Wade held Zelda close as they moved through the first dance, and she could feel the rapid beating of his heart against her cheek. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I knew was possible," Zelda replied. They left the celebration as the sun was setting, riding together up into the mountains toward the cabin that was now their home. The high country was lush with summer growth, and the air smelled of pine and columbine. When they arrived, Wade carried Zelda over the threshold, and she laughed with delight at the changes he had made. The cabin was twice its former size now, with real glass in the windows and a wood floor instead of packed earth. There were curtains she had sewn herself and furniture Wade had built during the long winter evenings. That night, as they lay together in the bed where she had once fought for her life, Zelda traced the line of Wade's jaw with gentle fingers. "I love you," she said. "I do not think I say it enough. I love you for saving me, but even more for all the ways you have loved me since." Wade caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I love you too," he said. "You gave me back my life, Zelda. You made me remember what it feels like to hope, to want something beyond just surviving. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of you." "You already are," Zelda said, and pulled him down into a kiss that held all the promise of their future. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Wade's ranch prospered, growing from a small operation to a respectable spread that provided a solid living. Zelda proved to have a talent for managing accounts and negotiating prices, skills honed during her time with her uncle's freight business. Together, they made a formidable team, facing down harsh winters and dry summers, cattle rustlers and mountain lions, all the challenges that life in the Colorado high country could throw at them. 2 years after their wedding, Zelda gave birth to a son they named Samuel Wade Owens, after her uncle and his father. The labor was difficult and frightening, and Wade held her hand through all of it, his face gray with fear but his presence unwavering. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Zelda's arms, Wade wept openly, overcome with relief and joy, and the ghost of old grief finally laid to rest. Samuel was followed 3 years later by a daughter they named Rose, and then 2 years after that by another son they called Henry. The cabin grew again, expanding to accommodate their growing family, until it was barely recognizable as the simple shelter where Wade had nursed Zelda back from the edge of death. The children grew up strong and wild and beloved, learning to ride before they could properly walk, helping with the cattle as soon as they were old enough to sit a horse safely. Wade proved to be a patient, devoted father, and watching him with their children, Zelda often felt her heart might burst from the fullness of her love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wade took Zelda back to the spot where he had found her, now marked by a cairn of stones they had built together. It was summer, the meadow golden with sun instead of white with snow, but the memory of that day remained vivid for both of them. "Do you ever regret it?" Wade asked, his arm around her shoulders as they looked out over the valley. "Staying here, choosing this life." Zelda leaned into him, solid and warm and familiar after a decade of sharing his life. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment, do you?" "No," Wade said. "Finding you that day, half frozen and stubborn as hell, determined to live, it changed everything for me. You changed everything. I was existing before you, just going through the motions. But you made me live again, Zelda. You gave me back my heart. You gave me mine," Zelda said softly. "When you carried me through that storm, you were carrying more than my body. You were carrying my future, our future, all the years we would share together. You gave me everything, Wade." He turned to face her, cupping her face in his work-roughened hands, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion of their first kiss. When they broke apart, both smiling, Wade pressed his forehead to hers. "Here is to another 10 years," he said. "And another 10 after that, and as many more as God grants us." "Always," Zelda agreed. "Through storms and sunshine, through every season, always together." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, their children's laughter drifting to them on the wind. The cabin stood solid against the mountain backdrop, smoke curling from its chimney, a beacon of warmth and home. Inside, their life waited for them, full and rich and hard-won. 20 years later, on a bright autumn afternoon, Zelda and Wade sat on the porch they had added to the house, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel had married a schoolteacher from Leadville and had 3 children of his own. Rose had become a doctor, one of the first women physicians in Colorado, and practiced in Denver. Henry was still at home, learning the ranch business and courting a miner's daughter with shy determination. Zelda's hair had gone silver at the temples, and Wade's beard was more gray than dark now, but the love between them had only deepened with time. They had weathered losses and celebrated triumphs, had buried friends and welcomed new life, had built something lasting in this wild, beautiful place. "Do you remember," Zelda said, her hand in Wade's as it had been for more than 30 years, "when you told me you were halfway to loving me?" "That night in the hotel, I remember," Wade said. "You were wrong," Zelda said with a smile. "You were already all the way there." "I could see it in your eyes." Wade laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Maybe so. I was trying to protect my heart, but you had already stolen it. From the moment I found you in that snow, fighting so hard to live, I was lost." "Not lost," Zelda corrected. "Found we both were." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the life they had built from that single moment of grace when a man found a woman freezing on a trail and chose to carry her to safety. It had been the defining moment of both their lives, the pivot point where everything changed, where 2 lonely, wounded souls found each other and discovered that love, when it comes, can heal even the deepest scars. Their story would be told for generations in Leadville, the tale of the woman who survived a blizzard and the cowboy who saved her, of how they fell in love in a cabin in the mountains and built a life that became a legend. But for Zelda and Wade, it was never a story. It was simply their life, lived with courage and devotion, with passion and partnership, with all the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of 2 people who chose each other and kept choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through storms and sunshine, until their last breath. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything.